There's a strange detail hiding in thousands of old photographs from the 1800s. It's not the horse-drawn carriages, not the clothing, not even the buildings. It's something most people overlook completely. Right there in the center of city squares, along sidewalks, and at busy intersections, you see enormous public drinking fountains. Not the small metal fountains we're used to today. These were massive, ornate, monumental. Some stood 20 feet tall. They were carved from granite and marble, decorated with bronze sculptures, mythological figures, and intricate stonework that looked more like the entrance to a palace than a place to get a drink of water. And the strangest part? They were everywhere. You see them in old photographs of New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia. You see them in London and Paris. They appear in Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Istanbul, Kolkata, and Cape Town. Different continents, different governments, different cultures. Yet somehow, during the exact same period of history, cities across the world were installing elaborate public fountains that gave away clean drinking water completely free. At first glance, it seems like a small historical detail. But once you start paying attention, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why were cities around the world suddenly building thousands of monumental drinking fountains all within the same 50-year window? And why did they almost all disappear just a few decades later? To understand how strange this is, you have to picture what these fountains actually looked like. Imagine walking through a city street in the late 1800s. Horse carriages pass by, street vendors shout from the corners, children run through the crowds. And in the middle of the square stands a massive stone structure. At the top, maybe a sculpture of Neptune holding a trident. Beneath it, several basins carved at different heights, one for adults, one lower for children, another basin closer to the ground where horses could drink. Some even included smaller bowls for dogs. Water flowed constantly from decorative spouts made of brass or bronze. The sound of running water echoed through the street. These weren't simple pipes sticking out of a wall. They were architectural masterpieces. Some had classical Greek columns. Others were designed with Gothic arches or Egyptian motifs. You could find fountains decorated with dolphins, gargoyles, angels, lions, or elaborate floral carvings. Each one was unique. Each one required skilled stone carving, metalworking, plumbing, and engineering. And there weren't just a few of them. There were thousands. London alone installed more than 800 public drinking fountains between the late 1850s and the 1970s. That's an average of around 40 fountains every year for 2 decades. Now multiply that across major cities in Europe, North America, South America, Asia, and Australia. We're suddenly looking at tens of thousands of fountains built in a surprisingly short amount of time. So naturally, historians have an explanation. According to the official story, these fountains were built by philanthropists. Wealthy individuals donated money to construct public drinking fountains as acts of charity. The idea was to provide clean water to people who might otherwise drink alcohol or contaminated water from unsafe sources. In places like London, organizations such as the Metropolitan Drinking Fountain and Cattle Trough Association helped coordinate the effort. On the surface, this explanation sounds reasonable, but when you start looking closer, the scale becomes difficult to explain. Because these weren't cheap structures. A single ornate fountain required expensive materials, skilled craftsmen, and complicated plumbing connections to city water systems. Multiply that by thousands. It raises a simple but important question. Where did all the money come from? And perhaps even more puzzling, who coordinated all of this? Think about it. If these were simply random acts of charity by different donors, you would expect the fountains to appear in scattered locations. But when historians and researchers began mapping where many of these fountains stood, a pattern began to emerge. In several cities, fountains were spaced at surprisingly regular intervals. Not based on property lines or neighborhood boundaries, but almost like a planned grid. In some cases, they were positioned along major travel routes through the city. In others, they appeared at distances that made it possible for pedestrians or horses to travel across the entire city without going too far between water sources. It begins to look less like random charity and more like infrastructure, almost like a coordinated public water network designed to serve an entire urban population. And if that's true, it suggests something fascinating. Cities in the 19th century may have been experimenting with something surprisingly modern: a universal public water system. Think about how revolutionary that idea would have been. For most of human history, access to water was limited. People relied on wells, rivers, or private water sources. In crowded cities, this often led to serious health problems. Water could easily become contaminated, leading to outbreaks of diseases like cholera or typhoid. Providing clean water freely to the public would have been an enormous improvement in urban life. And these fountains may have been one of the earliest attempts to solve that problem. But that still leaves another mystery. How did they work? Because these fountains weren't connected to simple wells. Most required a continuous flow of pressurized water. That means they had to connect to underground pipes, reservoirs, and pumping systems capable of delivering clean water throughout the city. Today, that seems normal, but in the mid-1800s, modern municipal water systems were still developing. Cities were only beginning to experiment with large-scale plumbing networks. Yet somehow, these fountains appeared almost everywhere, even in places that were still considered frontier towns at the time. Photographs exist of elaborate public fountains in mining towns, colonial outposts, and rapidly growing settlements where basic infrastructure was supposedly still under construction. So how did those places manage to support complex water features? The answer might be simpler than it first appears. The 19th century was actually a period of massive infrastructure development around the world. Cities were building railways, sewer systems, gas lighting networks, and large reservoirs to support growing populations. As these water systems expanded, public fountains may have been added as a visible symbol of civic progress. They were practical, but they were also symbolic. Think about the message a fountain sends. Running water represents abundance, cleanliness, and prosperity. A beautiful fountain in the center of a city square told residents and visitors something important. This city has clean water. This city cares about public health. This city has modern infrastructure. In other words, the fountains were both useful and political. They were monuments to progress. But if that's true, then another question appears. Why did they disappear? Because by the early 20th century, many of these fountains were suddenly gone. Cities that once had hundreds of public drinking fountains began removing them. Some were dismantled, others were relocated to parks or museums. Many simply vanished. And the reasons were surprisingly practical. As cities modernized, plumbing moved indoors. Homes, businesses, and public buildings began installing their own taps and sinks connected directly to municipal water systems. Suddenly, people didn't need to walk to a public fountain to get a drink. They could get water inside buildings. At the same time, the rise of automobiles changed city streets. Many fountains had originally been built with basins for horses, but once cars replaced horse-drawn transportation, those features became unnecessary. Maintaining large stone fountains in busy intersections also became difficult as traffic increased. So, gradually, cities removed them. Not because they were hiding anything, but because they were no longer needed. And yet, their disappearance still leaves an interesting cultural gap. Because these fountains once played a central role in daily life. People met around them. Travelers rested beside them. Children played in the spray of water on hot summer days. They were gathering places. They were landmarks. They were part of the rhythm of city life. Today, Most people walk through cities without ever realizing that such a system once existed. Instead of monumental fountains in public squares, we have small metal drinking fountains tucked inside schools, airports, or office buildings. Water is still available, but it's hidden, quiet, private. The grand public celebration of water has faded away, and perhaps that's why these fountains feel so mysterious when we look back at old photographs. They remind us that cities once treated water differently, not just as a utility, but as something worth celebrating, something worth building monuments for. Because water isn't just another resource, it's the foundation of life in every city. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, every civilization still depends on the same simple element that has sustained human life for thousands of years: clean water. Maybe that's the real story behind these forgotten fountains. Not a lost civilization, not a hidden conspiracy, but a moment in history when cities proudly displayed the infrastructure that made modern life possible. A moment when progress was carved in stone and bronze and placed right in the middle of the street for everyone to see. And while those fountains may be gone, the systems they represented are still with us, hidden beneath our feet. Pipes stretching for miles under the pavement, reservoirs storing millions of gallons, pumping stations quietly moving water across entire regions. We rarely think about it, but the modern world still runs on an invisible network designed to deliver one thing: a simple glass of water. So, the next time you see one of those old photographs, a crowded street, horse carriages passing by, and a massive fountain standing proudly in the center of the square, take a moment to appreciate what it represents. Not just a beautiful piece of architecture, but a reminder of how cities once celebrated the most essential resource on Earth: water. And maybe, just maybe, it's worth asking whether modern cities have lost something important by hiding that miracle underground. Because sometimes the most fascinating parts of history aren't the things we remember. They're the things we stopped noticing. And once you start noticing them again, the past suddenly becomes a lot more interesting.